thank everyone for creating this space. And as people are coming in, I think even before Dan and I get into the dialogue, which we are sincerely hoping is going to be quite interactive, we thought to set the tone, we're going to just give you an opportunity to do something that perhaps you will never be able to do again in the context of an academic conference for business schools, okay? So just a very brief opportunity. So I'm going to invite you just to stand up for a moment, okay? And the invite is to tap into a little bit more than your considerable intellect. So we know, in this room we have some serious analytical, rational, intellectual clout. And to tap into what you feel, sense, and perhaps to even act on it, okay? Now, I'm going to say a word. In fact, it's a word that you've heard a few times today and yesterday. I'm going to say a word, and when you hear that word, the invite is for you to just sense where that word lands in your body, okay? Where you feel it. And if you want, to even perhaps just act it out for a second, doing something with your head, with your hands, with your feet, okay? So trust the process, okay? And if you're more comfortable, you can even close your eyes. Fortunately, Barry and Priya has given us some breathing techniques, okay? So you can close your eyes, just take a deep breath, just gather yourself. Deep breath, just hold it, and out, okay, you're here. Okay, so the word is collaborate. Just hold that. Just sense where you feel that. Okay, whether it creates any movement in you, anything you want to act out. Okay, great. So that's the exercise. You've had an opportunity to tap into, for just a few seconds, into what you feel. And you can act it out. Okay. I'm going to invite you to sit down. I'm going to ask Dan to first tell us what he felt. Dan?
Thanks, John, for asking me to talk about that. I did close my eyes. Mm-hmm. And, I think typical for Dan, one of the first things that popped into my mind was the word trust, mm-hmm. which I think is sort of foundational. But one of the things I noticed, I didn't expect knowing in advance what you mm-hmm. were going to do, I didn't expect this would happen, but I noticed that I started like this, mm-hmm. but then I finished like this. Mm-hmm. And I think that has something to do with the word you chose, mm-hmm. John. So thanks for that observation I was able to make about myself.
Great. Thanks, Dan, and thanks for opening the floor. Let's maybe just get a sample from everyone else, just so that we get a sense of what's in the room if you sense, feel, and perhaps act out collaboration. Maybe it's an ingredient, maybe it's a precondition, maybe it's a result. Can we maybe just hear one or two people that are prepared to just give us a...
So immediately I noticed that my hand went over my heart, and I just had this calm, warm feeling. In my mind, I saw like a ring of hands and holding hands with folks.
Wonderful, thanks. Anyone else?
Okay, I'm going to be the spoiler here. Mm-hmm. The image that came into my mind immediately was the blue hole mm-hmm. off the coast of Belize. And the blue hole is this wonderful, beautiful, natural wonder that looks so sublime, and everybody wants to dive in to the surface because it's so clear. And then you get in, and the hole just gets deeper and darker. You don't ever get anywhere, and you don't know where the hell you are. And so for me, collaboration always starts off as something I really want, but I've never, ever seen it really translate into implementation.
Great, thanks for that perspective. Maurice?
When you said, let's act it out, I did this. Because there's a sense of embracing. Mm-hmm. And embracing each other, hugging each other, and making sure that we help each other go through the crises and challenges and have people that you can walk with.
Great, thank you very much for those offers. And I'm sure that there are more perspectives in the room, and we'll get to that in a moment. We just wanted to set that tone. And I think now, we can take a brief moment just to introduce ourselves and to say something a little bit about GRLI and GBSN's work. If you're curious about what we just did, and it's great that we've been doing the breath work as well, Some of our work at the GLI is around whole person learning, around bringing and developing and involving the entire human being. So that's just a small taster. But let's maybe then start, Dan, with some introductions.
Okay.
Seeing as we spoke about whole person, maybe you just want to say something about who you are, and then
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm recalling the last time we were together presenting. It was, 2000? It was 10 years ago.
Yeah, 2015.
But when we first met at Rio Plus 20 in Rio, and it's just a pleasure to be with you again, but also a pleasure to be back here at AABS. I just want to say that up front. I think many of you were around from the inception. I think it's fair to say that the GBSN, the Global Business School Network, was at least influential in helping to form AABS in the early days. So it's great to see its development. I'm sorry that it's been a while. I started about 5 years ago at GBSN, and this is the first time I've been back since I started. Before going to GBSN, though, I worked at AACSB and came to several meetings over the years and was able to see the development of AABS, and it's just fantastic what I'm seeing here. A little bit about the Global Business School Network. We're about 150 business schools now. 5 years ago, we were about 60, depending on how you count. We're in about 50 countries, and basically what we do is we bring business schools together to strengthen their contributions to inclusive and sustainable development. I think in the early days, we would have said economic development. We would have talked about economic growth and job creation, but today, of course, just recognizing all of our conversations, it's about inclusive and sustainable development. And we could talk more about how we do that as we go, but that's just a basic introduction to GBSN. GRLI?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start briefly just by saying that, yes, I'm South African based here, working globally, but I grew up not far from here, studied at the University of Pretoria, and just a small personal story just to provide some context to the work that we're doing. When I entered high school in Pretoria, all Afrikaans white boys' school, you can imagine 1990, 2 years before Mandela was released. Very interesting time. By the time just before I graduated, 1994, of course we had the inauguration of President Mandela. Having witnessed from age 13 to age 17, that immense transformation, and then being invited as part of our school's body to serve as waiters, and Morris was talking last night about being servant leaders or service leaders. So being able to serve at the inauguration of President Mandela, having seen that transformation, was an incredible experience and has shown that a lot of what is socially constructed, including how we run our economies and businesses, can in fact change and perhaps needs to change. So long story short, University of Pretoria, MBA, and went on into consulting, where around the time of the financial crash, the question around sustainability was increasingly on the cards. And so as a recovering management consultant that helped set up the sustainability consulting division of Accenture at the time, came back to South Africa and started working with the GLI. Now, Dan alluded to the fact that we met in Rio Plus 20. That was in 2012, where we published a vision of what a business school looks like if people and planet matters. You're welcome to go and have a look at it. It's called 50 Plus 20. But it's one of many collaborative initiatives that it's worked on over the years, which included, starting in 2003 with EFMD, holding a call for global responsibility. Quite simply asking, what is it? How do we develop it? That led to developing the principles for responsible management education, later on things like the sustainability literacy test, the positive impact rating, and a number of initiatives in the landscape that could not have happened without deeper collaboration amongst business school leaders and business schools. So I think, having given you a little bit of context about what we're doing, maybe it's time to just step back and, building on this morning's conversation, acknowledge the global context and the African context. Dan, do you want to kick us off with just some thoughts on our global context? And I'd be happy to fill in.
Actually, in the spirit of making up some time, why don't we jump right in? Because you have some slides that you want to share.
Okay, so very briefly, we've recognized, and I think it was kind of alluded to over the last few days, that we have serious geopolitical challenges. I mean, there are 100 armed conflicts globally, of which 2 or 3 are very prominent, of course, at the moment. We're faced with a number of serious environmental, ecological kind of challenges. Social inequality appears to be growing. And, what we're seeing across this crises of environment, of society, of governance, and of course of the economy, is that there are certain limitations to how things work. And you may hear people just saying, gosh, the system needs to change. We need systems change, or things are really tricky at the moment. Some people refer to it as a big mess. But in summary, really, it appears that we need systemic reforms across many different sectors, and that we need to reevaluate on the whole how we relate to our own humanity, to others, and to the planet, quite simply. So there's this growing awareness, this acknowledgement that we find ourselves in a very messy time that's perhaps complex and messier than we are entirely prepared to deal with. So I think that's kind of globally, if we could frame it, some people prefer the term polycrisis or permacrisis or meta-crisis, and there are a number of things around that. But that begs the question, what are we going to do about that as management educators, as business schools? And so we want to share a little bit of thoughts on that between Dan and myself, and then turn it to the floor to tap into the wisdom that is here. Dan, do you want to continue from there?
Certainly.
Sure. Okay.
I appreciate the opportunity. John and I talked a little bit about this before we got started, and once we get that sort of global context, which we've talked about throughout this event, right? So this is nothing new. We're all in this mindset that we have this massive set of issues, very interconnected set of issues, problems that we need to deal with. So the question is, what we as business schools can do. And when I think about this, I may be oversimplifying, but Catherine said something a little while ago. It's sort of, what is that something, right? We don't know what it is, but if we look at, for example, South Africa, if we look at unemployment, we look at poverty, it's hard for me to imagine solving those problems without growth, without growing the economy. Right? And we know a little bit about economic growth, not as much as we ought to, right? But thanks to some work, Bob Solow, Paul Romer, we know that innovation plays a pretty important role, right? And I believe that one central role of business schools is as a catalyst for innovation. And we can begin to unpack what that means, but I think for business schools, thinking about themselves as catalysts for innovation is very important. Now, I hope we can unpack that a little bit, but I want to get on to the second opportunity. And I know it's going to sound very simple, but it's innovation, number one, improvement, number two. I think, and when I listen to these conversations, sometimes I think we think our role is to teach students management. Right? Which sounds about right, doesn't it? But I think it's about improving management. One time I got a call, when I worked at AACSB, I used to handle a lot of the media calls. And the question was quite simple. Why are so many people interested in MBA programs? And I know the caller expected me to say something rather profound, but after, I think, an excruciating amount of time for the reporter, I came back and I said, well, it's because management, especially doing it well, is really hard. That's it. That's what I said. It didn't make it it wasn't provocative enough. But this idea that we know how to do management, we know how to manage and do it well, is ridiculous, right? Our job is to improve management. So when we think about this idea of improvement, it's about that, but I think it's also about, when I think about why business schools need to play a role, I call it the multiplier effect, right? So the neat part about managers is that if one person gets it right, they help many others get it right in an organization. There's a multiplier effect, right? So we have an opportunity in business schools, if we're really strong at being catalysts for innovation, helping us to find out what are those things that we're not doing now that we can do by bringing people together, by creating new insights, by driving the demand side, by connecting the supply and the demand side for innovation. That's a role we can play. We can also play a role where we're improving management consistently, right? Helping us to do it better and to share that. Because when we think about our role, especially when we're in this room, people from all over the world come to this room to learn how to do management, right? And we spread that all over the place. So 2 things.
Great. So innovation and improvement.
Yeah, I know that's
What-
oversimplified, but that's
wonderful.
that-
Wonderful.
Yeah.
But then I have a question, which is, where have you seen where have you seen thinking and acting? And so, we don't, maybe not so much sensing, but where have you seen thinking and action that is actually pointing us in that direction? So in your work in GBSN and globally, any kind of immediate examples that come to mind?
I'm thinking back at what you and I talked about before this, and that wasn't in the discussion, but it's a good question. I'm going to answer it with 2 things. One is what I've seen in terms of different ways of thinking about the role of business schools as we move forward. Maybe just 3 things. I'm going to try to get it right. One thing that I think is increasingly important is what I call leading beyond the school. And this has come up several times, right? It's about leading in the ecosystem, right? And we're not always thinking about that. When we become leaders, we become deans in a school, it's about making that school better. But obviously, we talked about things like, you talked about competition, right? It's pre-competitive discussions, right? So you set the landscape, and then you compete like hell, right? So one thing is leading beyond the school, leading the ecosystem. Paul Pullman has a couple of chapters in his book. One is called 1 + 1 = 11. The other is called It Takes 3 to Tango. And it's all about leading beyond. Right? A second thing that I think is important, let me go back and make sure I get this right. But a second thing that I think is important is, I'm going to apologize for this. I worked at AACSB. I just sat through this discussion about accreditation. But I think one of the things that I'm saying is that we need to think beyond quality, or at least what we think quality means. Right? A very simple set of examples, right? Is quality about selectivity or not about selectivity, right? We think at GBSN it's about access, right? Quality matters, but so does access, right? So it's fundamental questions like that. And then finally, and this is, I'll end with this. Sorry, John, I'm probably taking too much time, but
no, we're okay.
One of the things I see about business, for example, I've heard it several times here, we act like business is the customer, which sounds reasonable, right? They hire our graduates. They also buy into our insights. So we think of business as the customer. To me, that makes it rather transactional, right? And more what I see is that business has similar goals and objectives to business schools. So the idea is, how can we partner with business to build more inclusive and sustainable communities, right? It's thinking like that I think drives a lot of what we've been doing. Yeah. And just a quick example, how many have heard of the REAP program at MIT? MIT is a very long-standing member of GBSN. It's Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. Every year, they have a cohort of 8 different communities around the world, and 5 different sectors are represented on teams in those communities. And they work on a project locally, right? But then they work together globally to accelerate economic development in their community. And they work on specific projects like diversity, all those kinds of things. But they're sharing with each other. They've now done this 10 years, 8 communities a year, that's 80 programs. Now they know a little bit about how this works. Right? So that kind of engagement, cross-sectoral engagement that accelerates economic development, that's the kind of work that I think we're talking about business schools doing.
Yeah. Maybe I can just add one example, because when I looked at the calendar this morning, I realized it's 1 June. The chairman of our board, Peter Mulgaard, and I think, Nicola, you shared a session with him recently, is starting his role at CBS today. But one of the initiatives that he helped initiate in the Netherlands when he was still at Maastricht was that a number of deans came together and said, instead of each one of us going away and writing our own societal impact agenda, we realized that we operate in a particular context. Now, the Netherlands is more homogenous, granted, than the African continent, and we all know that. However, I think there's something small in, seeing the need to, as Dan alluded to, leading beyond the logo of one entity and saying, gosh, perhaps, if we're serious about impact, it shouldn't be just my school's impact report or a societal impact agenda, but perhaps it's something collective. But it's just a small example that comes to mind. So I want to move us along. I'm not going to go into detail on this now because I think it's already kind of been touched on. We've spoken a lot about climate change and some of the other areas. But I think it is perhaps important just to recognize, okay, we know that there are at least kind of 9 planetary boundaries that sustains our planet, again, in the global context. And that as the measurements are becoming more accurate, we now know that we're exceeding at least 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. So, I mean, this is basically the safe operating space for humanity and life on Earth, okay? And you're welcome to go and have a look at the work of the Stockholm Resilience Center. But within that context, where we need economic growth, but we've also have this reality, you know, we're kind of looking for new models, and some of you may already be familiar with some of the work that Kate Raworth has been doing around the so-called donut economics that, you know, that kind of acknowledges the ecological ceiling or the planetary boundaries, but also establishes a minimum for the social foundation, you know, that kind of ensures that education, peace, justice, political voice, gender equality, and so forth is being addressed. I said I will put it on the slide, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Donut Action Lab. But I guess the question then is, you know, again, in an African context, not as simple. You know, we've heard that we need to ensure that people are lifted out of poverty, that we create jobs. The African continent only, you know, if you take climate change as an example, only contributes 3% to global emissions. You know, the economic growth that we've seen since 1990 globally, only 5% of the economic growth has gone to the poorest 60%. We've added 370 million people globally to the below $5 a day poverty line. Somehow, what we're advocating for in terms of economic growth is not necessarily trickling down. If we were to follow the current models of economic growth, it'll take us 207 years to eradicate poverty, and that's just poverty. And that will be without taking into account that we will be destroying the actual life support systems of the planet that ensures a viable economy at first. So that sounds pretty dismal. However, we all believe, and I think that's why all of us are here, that business schools, management education can and must play a role in addressing this. So what we wanted to do, and I just want to get a time check. I don't know, Jad, how much time do we have left? Okay, so let's take 5 minutes. In smaller groups, you can turn to the person next to you, maybe threes or pairs, and look at what we're proposing as an inquiry. Okay, and this is just a suggestion, is how might African business schools foster collaboration? Because we're talking about collaborating, but are we really doing it? How might we foster collaboration within and beyond business schools to address the meta crisis? And we're suggesting that you can maybe unpack this at 2 levels. You can start with the personal perspective. Does this question resonate with me? Is it urgent, or is this important and urgent to me? So maybe just turn to the person next to you and share with them, is this important and urgent to me? And once you've bottomed that out between the 2 of you, maybe look at the collective perspective. What might we, i.e. AABS as a collective, and this could serve in other contexts as well, do together that would benefit all of us? Okay, so that's what we're suggesting just for 5 minutes, and then Dan and I will take some comments from the floor and see if we can make some sense of it.
Sounds good.
Great. 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so
Thanks.
I apologize for interrupting because it appears that some of you are still in deep discussion, but let's see if we can get some perspectives from those that have been engaging with this question, or maybe you have a better question. We didn't put that on there. If you have a better question to be asking, you're also welcome to share that. So let's hear who's prepared to take a first stab at it. Please go ahead.
Hi.
And just say your name. Sure.
My name is Akash, and I come from GMAC.
Okay.
So we together discussed about this, and I'll speak about the first one, the personal perspective, and Priyal is going to talk about the second one, the perspective. So the personal perspective was, in one single statement, there's this very famous book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So that is the extent to which the question of meta-crisis is important. So whatever we've been doing, we are at a cusp where we can change, where as a community, as a country, as a continent, we're at a cusp where we can change, and we have that ability to change. So we need to change things, change whatever we've been doing traditionally, and adopt new things. So that's more of a personal perspective. From a collective perspective, I think it's going to add more.
From a collective perspective, just having this type of platform, the business schools actually have a huge opportunity to influence business. And because every business brings their leaders to be influenced by business schools. And so, but it's also not about staying the same. I mean, in the last 18 years, if we have to ask ourselves how much have we actually changed and what have we done differently, the question is what's still holding us back from doing things differently and trying new things. So having the collaborations are excellent, together, but then it's what next and what do we actually do practically.
Thank you. Any other hands? Let's hear a few perspectives before we... Nicola.
I just want to thank Owen because he triggered something for me. And I think some of this is, when you were talking in the beginning, is what do we have to unlearn as business schools? What do we have to unlearn as the academy? And Owen spoke about intellectual honesty. And I think we've built up our careers and our professions by being the knowledge we know and we just don't know. And so to be able to have a place where we can actually convene with a level of vulnerability that will then lead to intellectual honesty, which is part of the foundation. I don't think you can collaborate without your sense of identity being appropriate for that collaboration. So that's kind of what's going through my mind.
And also an underlying, from what I'm hearing, an underlying acknowledgement of not knowing and being prepared to hold the question. Wonderful. I saw some really deep conversations taking place. I'd love to hear also from the back if there's anything.
For us, with respect to question one, we all agree that it is very important because it's about our survivor and all of that. Then coming to question two, we asked the question, what is the objective of education? We believe that education basically is to bring about a change in behavior, transformation of the human and stuff like that. And at the core of education is instruction or pedagogy. So we asked a question that we didn't have an answer to, and we felt we could bring it to the plenary. Mm-hmm. How can we focus on innovative pedagogy in order to bring about the change in behavior that we require as far as the issue at stake is concerned? So that is what we focused on. Thank you.
So innovation and pedagogy,
yes,
which I think also builds on what Dan was saying. It's innovation not only for innovation's sake, and we always talk in the GLI about relational innovation. There's a lot of technological innovation taking place in progress, but how we relate to our own humanity, to others, and to the planet is something that, in the current global context, perhaps needs some revisiting or refreshing. So thank you very much for that. Cherise, were you back? No, okay, no, thanks. Yeah, over here, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Our discussion, the first one, we share about our personal view. So it's very important. So since it's a global problem, it is difficult to solve by alone. So it's important, but we need more collaboration with other partners. So when it comes to the second one, since it is global problems, in order to address these problems, we have to implement experiential education model. That means Mr. Dan mentioned that MIT experience. So we need such project-based of education system in our curriculum, and we have to practice those things. So at the same time, when we teach, at the same time, we solve those problems in practical. So we have to use this kind of model as a collaboration to address this problem.
Can I say that I agree 100%? I've written before that the future of management education is experiential, right? For lots of reasons, including what's happening with technology and access to content and things like that. You know, there was the fellow from Momar, did I get? One of the things that really impressed me about that was that he used a specific example. How do we improve mobility in Africa? Right? And when I thought about the list of programs that they were developing, these were programs that seemed to be defined less by what we thought the jobs would be for graduates and more about the issues or challenges or opportunities that we would see across Africa. What struck me, I think it's not just the pedagogy, sort of how we do this, but I think it's the kinds of questions we ask them to address and bringing together the resources, the different stakeholders in a way that helps them to achieve that. So it means breaking down some of those silos, as we've talked about before. It means thinking differently about the way we do education to pedagogy. So right on track with all of that.
Absolutely. So we had a comment from Maurice and then from Rolf.
I think question number 2 I'm going to refer to. Just looking at as a body in Africa of business schools, we've got a body called AU, and it's got a vision called 2063, the Africa we want. And I tested with my students here, MBA students, I asked them a question. How many of you know about 2063 Africa agenda? I think there was 3 people there in a class of about 40 people. And then I asked, is there any contribution you can make? There was just dead silence. The question is how can we as AABS, I heard Lana is collaborating with it, but how can we collaborate with AU to really prepare our students to understand this 2063? Probably most of us here will not be around 2063, but they will be around. And it's their vision and it's our grandchildren. And marshal all our intellectual capital, research capability to strengthen that vision to be delivered in 2063. That would be my recommendation.
Thanks, Maurice. And just before we turn to Rolf, just a quick reflection on that. 2063 is an awfully long way out for people when they start thinking about it, which is why we titled the session 2030, which is a little bit more immediate, and which, by the way, coincides with, I think, the Agenda 2030 of the UN in terms of the SDGs. So perhaps we also need that urgency. Rolf?
Yeah, thanks. Just 2 points. The first, I'd like to challenge Dan a little bit about, well, each of us, I suppose, individually and perhaps as schools, in terms of revisiting this question that you asked about who our customer actually is. And is it the business or the businesses out there? I don't know. I think for me, I think of a girl child in the township. That's my client, actually. She's not paying me, but all that I do in the business school needs to somehow link to her well-being. And that really changes what I do and how I do it.
Yeah.
So
and who you do it with, right? I mean, I think that's the key with the collaborations. And that was the point, that I think that you'll find a number of businesses that share that same objective about who the customer is. And I think if we work with business in that way, rather than try to serve business as a customer or as a supplier, I think you'll be on the right track.
And so the second point, John, you mentioned this idea of systems change, and in our thinking around systems, with the agency of possibility for changes around leverage points. And we actually are very powerful leverage points in addressing things like climate, inequality, economic growth concerns. And there's a lot of money globally sloshing about looking for leverage points and accountability. And I think there's a real potential for business schools to step up to approach some of those global pots of money and to say, we actually can change the way business thinks about this. We can train business leaders. We can convene the conversations that matter in Africa. And those pots of money, they don't want to give away $1 million. They want to give away $100 million. And as an individual business school, it's not that easy, but as you can write a proposal that goes for $100 million. And that, I think, is, for me, part of the second question.
And I'm almost anticipating the nervousness from Lana, because there's some suggestions around, what AABS might do. And I'm immediately going to say, AABS is us, right? So how can we take a small step together, like you're suggesting, Rolf, to perhaps write that collaborative grant for $100 million rather than individual schools trying to do it, which is, But you also touched on, there was and you said, it could be the girl child in the township or There was a beautiful blog article written by Catherine Trebek of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that said, what if instead of GDP, our measure was girls on bikes? Okay? And just very simply put, if streets are safe enough for girls to cycle to school, it means they're getting an education, which affects, a lot of things, as we know, gender, economic development. So maybe we need to be a little bit creative about what it is that we're aspiring to. I think we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to hear from whether there's any kind of concluding thoughts from your side, just in terms of what you've heard. And
yeah, well, across all of the sessions, not just this one, I think this idea of together obviously is critical. And I feel like at least I came away with a better understanding about what some of those opportunities might be. I think it is the research. I think it is pedagogy. I think it is experiential, right? Sometimes if we think together about that experience, we different, better things. So congratulations on all of insights driven around this idea of collaboration.
Absolutely. And from my side, also to echo Dan's sentiment around being very encouraged by what we're seeing here in terms of the AABS community and collective, not only developing a local and regional perspective and initiatives, but I really want to urge us to consider whether what we do at AABS could perhaps influence the way things are also being done in other parts of the world. I'm obviously biased. I'm an African, grew up here, came back here after working in other parts of the world, passionate about the continent and the people, and I truly believe there are some things that we can model here that can benefit all of us, i.e. other parts of the world. So the process we use to get to the future is the future we get. I would urge us to really think carefully about the process we use going forward as a community so that it reaches an outcome that benefits all of us. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to everyone who was prepared to share their thoughts. We'd love to continue the conversation.
Thanks.